Hello, welcome to Legally Speaking. I'm your host, Sophia Haynes. Legally Speaking is a public service of You and the Law, a nonprofit whose mission is to provide information and resources to empower you in your legal affairs. While we provide legal information, it is in no way intended to be legal advice. So if you have a legal issue, make sure that you retain the services of a licensed attorney. Today we're talking about the laws against animal cruelty. We've seen a lot in the news about situations where animals have been left either abandoned or neglected in other ways, and a lot of people are not aware that there are laws against that. So we brought in one of the foremost experts in that area, Deputy Chief Assistant Solicitor Kelly McMichael, to give us some information about exactly what animal cruelty is and some of the laws that are in place that protect the animals and prosecute the offenders. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you for coming on the show. We appreciate you coming and sharing expertise with us. Could you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am Deputy Chief over the trial line at the DeKalb Solicitor's Office under Ms. Sherry Boston. What that means is that I supervise all of the attorneys who try the cases, all misdemeanor cases in DeKalb County, which include animal cruelty. Prior to this, I was the animal cruelty special prosecutor for the county, which meant if anyone was charged with misdemeanor animal cruelty, I was the supervisor or the prosecutor on the case. I've been with DeKalb County for almost 5 years now. Prior to that, I was down in South Georgia in Albany as a public defender. Prior to that, I was a divorce attorney. So
It sounds like you've been around for a while, Kelly.
Just a little while.
All right. Now, let's just start off with the basics. What is animal cruelty?
Well, animal cruelty in Georgia is divided into essentially two different things. You can be charged with felony animal cruelty or misdemeanor animal cruelty.
Now we'll get into the law in a minute. But just tell us basically what does it look like, I guess, is the question.
Well, it looks like an animal being neglected. An animal, it can either be starved, and you can tell by its physical appearance that it's just malnourished. An animal can look like it's been disfigured, or an animal can be fighting. There are animals that are, heard of dog fighting or cockfighting, things of that nature. That is also animal cruelty. Essentially anything where an animal is harmed and suffers when it's not part of a agricultural type situation. There are exceptions in the law for non-domesticated animals, such as you can use working horses, cows, chickens, those type of things. Those are not your typical animal cruelty case because those are under the Department of Agriculture. So farm type animals and working animals are separate from your domesticated animals. So we're only talking about essentially what people think about as their household animals, their pets, things that they will have in their house.
Okay, so are we talking about acts of omission or are we talking about acts of commission?
For animal cruelty, in particular misdemeanor animal cruelty, you don't have to have an overt act. You can have an omission. So that means you're failing to care for your animal. If you have a pet in your house and you leave them, and you say move out and you just leave them there, or you tie them to a tree when it's hot outside and you leave them there. It's the omission. You can omit feeding them, giving them appropriate water, caring for them. So it doesn't actually have to be a physical act. People would think, oh, it's not nice when you kick your dog. You know they feel pain. You can tell from the way they react. Sometimes it's just simply not properly caring for them.
So what if, is it medical stuff too? Maybe the dog had worms or something along those lines. Is that considered animal cruelty? Are we talking about like neglect or abandonment type issues? What are we talking about when we're talking about the animal cruelty? Or is it both?
It's both. When you have an animal that it needs care, and you know that it needs care, we've seen animals that have a broken leg. And it's very obvious that their leg is broken, but their owner is not going to give them the appropriate care. They can be charged with animal cruelty for not getting their animal appropriate care. It's essentially, that's neglect of the animal, a willful neglect. So it can be that type of situation as well.
So, when we talk about abandonment of an animal, is it just I moved and left the animal there, or are there other types of abandonment of the animal?
In most circumstances, you're going to see it's just moving and leaving the animal there. However, there's general ordinance violations or things like if you take your animal and leave it in a location. Say you drove your animal out to a farm or a pasture, a park, and just let the dog go. That is as well abandoning the animal at that location, and you can be charged under different laws, different ordinances, not necessarily state law for that.
So if I have my dog and I just live at the park and drove off, that's an actionable offense.
Yes, ma'am.
Interesting. Well, I do remember prosecuting some cases, and we saw a lot of stuff in the summertime where animals left in the cage in the summertime. Is that a form of animal cruelty?
It is. An animal can die from heat stroke very quickly. Their body temperature is actually higher than our body temperature.
Okay.
So it takes less time for them to elevate to their body temperature to rise to a level where they would die, say, of heat stroke. So say the circumstances, you have a pet and you have somebody who comes over to your house and they're afraid of your pet, your dog. Okay. And so you take your dog and you tie them up outside. But it happens to be August in Georgia and close to 100, and you don't give them any shade or any water. It is in just a few hours that dog can pass on.
Really?
And you can be charged for animal cruelty for the death of that dog.
So it's as simple as a little shade and putting a bowl of water out there.
And then you wouldn't, there wouldn't be any problem.
And there is no issues at that point. Yeah, and I do remember cases where people would just leave the animal locked in the house, and I never understood why not just leave them in the front yard, as opposed to just leaving them locked in the house. So how long would it take for the animal to starve to death like that?
It depends on the body type of the animal. A smaller animal is going to deteriorate much more quickly than a larger animal. But it will take 2-3 days for an animal to completely, to pass on based on starvation and dehydration. It just really also depends if there's anything available in the residence for them to sustain themselves. The sad situation is a lot of times people are being evicted or they have to leave the place because they can't take their animals with them. And so they don't know what to do, and they just leave them locked in the apartment or the home or wherever it is that they're leaving. And those animals have no chance of survival at that point because they cannot fend for themselves. They cannot open the door to get out. They cannot, turn on a faucet to get water. They can't. And it's such an easy solution. If you have to leave your residence and you can't take your animal, it's so easy to surrender it to your local county shelter or the Humane Society or any of those places. If you just say, I can't take care of this animal anymore, or I can't keep this animal anymore, before the animal gets in bad shape, you can surrender the animal. No charges are brought against you. It just is, a surrendering of an animal. And
I'm wondering if people even know about that, or are there anything within the shelter's regulations that wouldn't allow them to take them? Because to me, that's a logical solution as well. Just take the dog to the shelter or take them to the Humane Society or something along those lines. So is there any regulations that you know of that would prohibit them from being able to do that?
No. Some counties have a requirement that you have to have that animal in that county. So if it were, in Fulton County, you would have to then surrender it to the Fulton County Animal Control. But it's different. If you're going to a nonprofit organization such as the Humane Society, they do have a $25 surrender fee. And that sometimes will prompt people not to do it because they can't pay the $25. But you can claim indigency, basically saying, I can't afford it, and see if they'll waive it. Or you can take it to the county shelter if there's a county-run shelter and they don't have the same charge. Sometimes it's fear. People, one, maybe don't know about it, and two, they're afraid that they'll get in trouble for surrendering their animal. But animal control would much rather have you surrender a healthy animal, one that they can then potentially adopt out, versus having an animal, essentially deteriorate and suffer inside a residence.
But see, I can't imagine why would you get in trouble for saying I can't afford to keep my animal. And I guess, that is a real situation for some people. Okay, let's talk about as a neighbor or a friend or something along those lines. What would I see in an animal to let me know that animal may be being neglected or being abandoned? Are we talking about thin bodies, hair falling off? I mean, what would I see to know that that animal may be being neglected?
Well, most animal cruelty cases are reported by neighbors, and because they just have a lot of concern for the welfare of the animal that they see. And it's generally because they see it constantly. A dog is chained up outside or tied outside or left in a yard, and no one provides it food. It doesn't have any shelter. That animal, essentially, a lot of people will say it ends up crying. But they'll hear it making not just your regular bark, which can be annoying to a neighbor, I understand. But there are different levels, and you can tell when an animal's in distress. They actually have a different bark, and they're trying to notify anyone that can hear them that they're in distress. But you can absolutely tell when you can see the backbone or the rib cages of an animal. That animal is underfed or malnourished for a reason. It may be that there's a medical cause behind it, or it could simply be that they haven't been fed. And then just your typical thing that you would see if you see mange.
And what does that look like? We hear a lot about the dog got the mange. What does that actually mean, and what does it look like?
Well, you'll see it most often in longer haired dogs or cats, where their fur is just matted together. It's very matted, very clumpy. It doesn't look like the animal's been brushed or cleaned or anything of that nature in a really long time. They look very bad. They look in bad shape. Oftentimes you'll see there's a lot of darkness, redness, all the clumpy around their eyes, a lot of crusting around their eyes as well. Just shows the general unkemptness of an animal. They just look very, very bad.
So he looks nasty, but what's actually going on with him if he has the mange?
Generally there's parasites.
Okay.
And the parasites are eating at his skin. And it's kind of unpleasant.
Yeah.
But their skin can get affected and essentially fall off the bones.
Oh, wow. So I see rib cages, I see mange. Am I seeing anything else?
An embedded collar. What happens is sometimes they will have animals who have a collar that is too tight for them. Or they've been chained to something for so long and they've been pulling on it so long that the collar is embedded in their skin. What that means is that the skin has actually grown around their collar because their necks have grown or have expanded over it, and the collar doesn't grow. But the animal has grown and outgrown their collar, and it's literally cut into their skin, and their skin has had to try and grow around it. It gets very affected and will cause their neck to swell, and it result in strangulation.
Wow. Anything else? I can't imagine anything else that you would not that you could possibly miss.
Those are going to be your main ones.
Yeah.
And just if you see a dog who can't walk, that has something, a disfigurement, or it just looks like it's in a lot of pain. I mean, those are your examples.
Wow. Okay. Well, I think it's a good part to take a break because we went through mange and hair and bones and everything else. And we come back, I want to talk about the whole court side of this because I know everybody has seen something of that nature. So we want to find out what's actionable and what can happen if you allow your animal to get to that particular condition. We'll be back in a couple of seconds. You are tuned into Legally Speaking, a public service of You and the Law. You and the Law is a nonprofit whose mission is to provide legal information and legal resources to empower you in your legal affairs. If you would like to have a question answered or a topic featured on Legally Speaking, feel free to contact us online at www.youandthelawtoday.org. You can also sign up there on our website for our mailing list, as well as follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Remember, with every right comes responsibilities, so know your rights and accept your responsibility. Welcome back. We're talking to Deputy Chief Assistant Solicitor Kelly McMichael about the laws of animal cruelty. Now, Kelly, before we left, we talked about exactly what animal cruelty was, some signs of it, and even places where you can take your animals so you don't have to have any issues. So now we want to talk about if individuals heard you but just didn't listen, and things that happen on the flip side within the court system. So we want to talk about what are some of the laws against animal cruelty. So can you tell us, person leaves the animal inside of a place after they've been evicted, and the authorities come up on this animal that's either starved to death or been left inside of this house. So what is that process at that point? I mean, what can we be charged with? Is misdemeanors, felonies, or what we're looking at?
Well, if you have in a situation where you've abandoned the animal and the animal has either gotten severely malnourished and dehydrated, or has died as the result of being abandoned, you're actually charged with a misdemeanor. Misdemeanor animal cruelty is act, omission, or willful neglect causing an animal to have unjustifiable suffering, pain, or death. So it can be a misdemeanor to cause the death of an animal. A misdemeanor, though, is punishable for up to a year in jail and a $1,000 fine. So you can have substantial punishments. Also, if you have multiple animals, you can get additional charges tacked on to that. So it can be a year or more, depending on
each charge. So how do I know if it's unjustifiable pain and suffering?
Well, the question would it be ever justifiable to leave an animal locked in a house? If you voluntarily leave the animal there. Now, it would be different if you, say, physically couldn't get back there, such as there was a natural disaster and there was no way for you to return to the house to get your animal.
Okay.
There's no way for that to be foreseen. That is not unjustifiable.
Okay.
Other than that, it's kind of hard to come up with a thought when it's justifiable to leave an animal to die of starvation or dehydration.
Okay. So you said that's misdemeanor, where I can get up to 12 months in jail for each, I guess, animal in that case. What makes it a felony? Is there a felony animal cruelty? There
is felony animal cruelty, and it's going to be subsequent misdemeanor offenses, or you're going to have a permanent disfigurement of an animal, where you've actually done something to disfigure that animal, such as break a leg, crop a tail, remove a body part of an animal when you're not a licensed veterinarian, something that will permanently disfigure an animal. So
if I kill him, it's a misdemeanor, but if I disfigure him, it's a felony?
Depending on the way in which you do it.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yes, it's a little bit different, but if you are, say, taking a sledgehammer to an animal and you kill the animal, you can be prosecuted for felony.
Okay.
If you simply allow the animal to starve to death, then it can be a misdemeanor, both resulting in the death of an animal. One is a little bit more, some would say, probably brutal.
Actually, it sounds like a commission as opposed to an omission. But actually, you actually intentionally did something if you left them in there as well.
Right.
Leave it to the lawyers. Leave it to the lawyers to figure out.
The other issue that we haven't addressed is dog fighting.
Oh, okay.
Dog fighting, if you are participating in a dog fight or you're raising dogs for dog fighting, it's going to be a felony. Okay. If you are a spectator at a dog fighting or cockfighting event in the state of Georgia, it is a misdemeanor. You could go
just to watch.
Just to watch.
Did y'all hear that? So if you just going to participate in watching the dogs, you didn't breed them, you didn't bring them to the show, you're just there watching, you can be charged with a misdemeanor animal cruelty.
Yes,
really?
ma'am. Yes.
Wow, so that is excellent information that people need to know, because a lot of times they think, well, I had nothing to do with it, I don't even know the dog's name, but you're there participating in it. Okay.
And of course, it's good to distinguish that dog fighting is not Spot and Fido out, and they out in the street and they get in a fight. It's an organized event where people have brought dogs in purposely to fight. It's completely different, and you know it when it happens. And I will say, as far as dog fighting, it's prevalent in this state, and if you do anything to aid in the actual event, such as you bring a dog, you train the dog, you bring a bait dog, what that means is the there are dogs that are bred just for being the bait, the training dogs, the dogs that the actual fighting dogs get trained on in essentially killing them.
Oh, wow.
Anything of that nature, helping get the location, spread the word, anything like that, you can be prosecuted as a felony for the actual participating in the dog fight or cockfighting, because that is also something that not as prevalent in metro Atlanta, but in other rural areas they still do cockfighting.
They still do cockfighting. Interesting. So what am I looking at on a possible sentence if I'm in this felony situation?
It really depends on the involvement. But in a felony situation, it is over. It can be punished for over a year, so you can potentially be looking at a prison sentence.
Okay.
So it's very hard to say in a felony event what you'll get, because it really just based on the circumstances. Recently people have gotten several years for taking a sledgehammer to a dog. The dog survived, but it was permanently disfigured. Has gotten several years in prison for that. Dog fighting rings, people have gotten obviously years in prison. Everybody is well aware of that situation. So it just depends on the level of involvement and what the actual incident is.
Okay, and does it take the same process as any other felony misdemeanor, your whole arraignment, jury trial, and all of that?
Yes.
In that process?
Yes.
And your formal sentencing?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about domestic violence. And because there are some links between that. So how can animal cruelty give you some insight on maybe that there is a domestic situation going on as well, and have animals been used against domestic violence victims?
There's actually a very well-documented link between animal cruelty and domestic violence. And the reason is because in domestic violence situations, the victim of domestic violence has been closed off from most of their family members and friends. That's just a trait of
the whole isolation part of domestic violence. Yes.
And usually the only people that they have is people or animals in that household. And the perpetrator of the domestic violence will use their love and their connection for the animal to torture the human. So they will threaten to harm the animals, and as it progresses they'll actually cause harm to the animals. You'll see, say if you have a neighbor that goes through a lot of animals, you don't know why, but there's a bunch of animals.
Always a different animal.
There's always a different animal, and you don't really know whatever happens to them. That's something that can trigger. Or if you're a teacher and you can ask your students, how many pets have you had? The students that can count their pets, know all their names, are the ones who say, oh, so many I can't. Those are the ones that you really need to look at as far as what's going on in the household, because it can be a sign of some sort of abuse going on in the household, because the abuser is using the attachment to the animals to punish the human.
And I think sometimes they use it to keep them quiet about the abuse as well.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that's a whole. I think a lot of people think, well, why should I get involved? The dog is starving. But sometimes that is more just a dog that's having a hardship in that particular situation. Was there anything that we didn't cover about animal cruelty that you think that the public should be aware about?
There is something, Sophia. It's a lot of times people will think, well, that's just kids being kids. If they'll see kids that may be torturing or picking on an animal or things of that nature. And what a lot of people don't realize is there's also a connection between animal cruelty and then future crimes. A lot of people will say it's a gateway crime.
Oh, okay.
So it can lead to considerable crimes later on, and you'll see if children are abusing animals, then one, you probably need to look into neglect in their household, but also be very concerned about the potential for violence later on. There's been a connection with the school shootings and animal cruelty. There's connections even up to serial killers and animal cruelty. So it is something to be gravely concerned about if you see a child who is torturing an animal. It is not just a child being a child. It's something that needs to be stopped, and there needs to be some intervention, and that child needs to get help.
And I can't imagine anyone saying that torturing an animal is just being a child. I guess that was never a part of my childhood, but and kids do stuff.
Yes.
But to the point where they're actually torturing animals, and then a lot of times they are mimicking behavior they're seeing because it may be an abuse in their household.
Absolutely.
Because of the whole domestic violence connection. Well, this show is all about resources. So where could an individual get more information about how can I recognize the signs of animal cruelty? Or if I know, based upon this conversation, I see rib cages hanging out. So what can I do to get more information on how to help the animal? What's out there for them?
Well, there are a lot of resources out there. The first and foremost is going to be, if you take an animal into your house, you need to be a good steward for that animal.
So what does that mean?
You need to be essentially their parent, because they can't fend for themselves. So you need to feed them, you need to water them, you need to keep them clean and bathe them, and when they're sick, you need to take them to a doctor. It's not only a time responsibility, but it's a financial responsibility. So before you take on that responsibility, you need to know that it is not also a temporary ability, but a lifelong obligation, the life of that animal. And then look around to see that if other people are being good stewards. There are classes that you can take before you get an animal to learn about what it is to take care of an animal. Most nonprofit animal agencies like the Humane Society, or even maybe your local county animal control service, has these classes that you can take. Resources, as far as if you think something is happening, contact animal control or your local police department and they can further investigate. Don't yourself investigate if you think an animal is being abused. It's really dangerous to start, going into other people's business because you really don't know. But you can contact the authorities and they can take over it, and they're trained to find out if that rib cage is something that somebody needs to be concerned about or not.
Very excellent information. Kelly, thank you so much for providing that for our audience, because the whole issue is if you don't do what you need to do, that there are criminal consequences for that. And I don't think a lot of people just thought about, if I can't take care of this animal, even if I can, I just don't want it anymore. There are avenues for them to be able to dispose of that animal in a way where the animal can be taken care of and they're not looking at future charges. So thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your information with our audience. I know that they will greatly benefit from it.
Well, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. We'll have to have you again. Well, there you have it, folks. We were talking about the laws against animal cruelty today, so that you can be aware of what your responsibilities are in the event that you decide to take an animal into your household. Remember, Legally Speaking happens every Sunday at 6, and we maintain the show that's debuted on Sunday through the entire week on our website on youandthelawtoday.org. And remember, until next time, with every right comes responsibilities. So know your rights and accept your responsibilities. We'll see you next week.